Welcome. I'm Dr. Sylvia Peregrino, and this is Entre Nosotras, Latina Voices. Today, I have the distinct honor of having Congressional Representative Veronica Escobar, who represents our District 16 here in El Paso and part of Horizon. Welcome, Congresswoman.
Thank you so much, Dr. Peregrino. It's wonderful to be with you.
Congresswoman Escobar, please tell us, how did you first get interested in public service?
Never, I have to say, I never imagined when I first became interested in public service that I would ever run for office, much less serve in Congress. So it was kind of a long and winding road. I moved back to El Paso after graduate school, and I was a teacher, and I was completely blissed out teaching. I taught here at El Paso Community College and also at UTEP, but I also felt very much a pull to wanting to change and improve things. And what got me interested in politics at the very beginning was immigration. When I moved back to El Paso in the early 90s from New York, from graduate school, there was a sense that, for me anyway, that there was some growing xenophobia in the community. We had a Border Patrol sector chief that was sending Border Patrol agents into Bowie High School to ask kids for their papers, basically. And I was really upset about that, and I saw it as discriminatory. I saw it as a dangerous, slippery slope. So I became an activist, an immigration rights advocate and activist. And then that slowly kind of led me into more and more civic engagement. And that civic engagement led me to volunteering for candidates. And I volunteered for candidates in the community for about a decade before I finally was convinced to run for office. And it's been an incredible experience.
Before running for Congress, you were previously our county judge. How is it different working in local government and working in Washington?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. In some respects, it's not very different, but in other respects, it's remarkably different. Serving in county government, obviously the focus is local issues. And my personal passion when I served in local government was healthcare. And it's why I was so involved with University Medical Center, which is a part of El Paso County. It's sort of an arm of El Paso County, the hospital district is. And we grew our services to the community while I was county judge. We built a children's hospital, the only standalone children's hospital on the US-Mexico border. We built healthcare clinics. And in the process, we created great healthcare jobs, but we also created greater access to healthcare for everybody. And so it was wonderful. It was amazing to be able to make such an impact and to be able to advocate for something, get the votes for it on the governing body, and then see it happen. You know, it's a relatively, I would say, a quick process, because every year you pass a budget and almost immediately you see the fruit of that labor. And when we, for example, worked on transportation projects, we're seeing them being built out all over the community. And so you can see the immediate impact of local government in a relatively short period of time. The federal government is a lot more challenging, and it can be really frustrating. It takes a lot longer for progress to be seen. It's a lot harder to get things across the finish line. You know, in county government, there were 5 of us on the governing body, so a majority was 3 people. In the House of Representatives, there's 435 of us, so a majority is 218 people. And it is significantly more challenging to pass legislation or to get appropriations that are specific to what you want to accomplish. So you have to have a lot of patience in federal government, in federal service. Things are obviously very polarized right now in Washington. They have been for a while. They're not as polarized at the local level. You know, you really, when there's a governing body of 5 people, you've got to find solutions. You've got to work together really closely. In a larger body, it's a lot harder to find consensus. And you know, the other thing that's a lot harder about Congress is because it is such a large governing body, even within your own political party, there are very differing views on different issues. So it's definitely a much tougher job. It's much harder to achieve success at the federal level. But I will also say it's incredibly rewarding. I've been so fortunate to have built great relationships with my colleagues, with the current administration. And so I've been able to move things outside of passing legislation. I've been able to move things administratively. I've been able to move things through the appropriations process. So we've seen some really great success. It's just taken a while to kind of figure out how to get there.
What would you say you're most proud of in what you've been able to accomplish? And I know personally, when I talk about Congress, I mention you and Sylvia Garcia as the first two Latinas to represent the state of Texas, and that's going to put you in the history books. And then I contrast that for the African American community. They did that with Barbara Jordan in, over almost 50 years, more than 50 years ago. And so for Latinas, it's taken longer. So I know personally, I'm proud of you for doing that, for accomplishing that for our state. But what are you proud of in terms of what you've been able to accomplish these past few sessions?
Well, you're right. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge something that you've pointed out, which is how long it's taken for us to achieve greater diversity in Congress, especially for Latinas and Latinos. And it's definitely, we are not where we should be in terms of representation of women and in terms of representation for people of color. I would say the Democratic Party is far more diverse than the Republican Party in Congress. And so we're gaining momentum, and we have, at least on the Democratic side, a House of Representatives that is starting to look more like America, which is good. But I am very proud of the fact that I call her my comadre. My comadre Sylvia Garcia and I were able to make history together. But there's so many moments and so many things that I'm really proud of in terms of what we've achieved. And I use the term we because none of this happens on its own. I have an amazing team of very talented public servants, both in the El Paso office and in the DC office, and people who I'm really lucky to work with and who are super dedicated to our community. And then I work collaboratively with local leaders and with stakeholders and groups and organizations. But I think, some of what I'm really proud of is the resources that I've brought home to El Paso. El Paso is an economically disadvantaged community, and we face pretty significant challenges, and in part there's a history to that. We live in a state where your access to health care depends on whether or not you have a job or what kind of a job you have, where your access to education depends on your zip code, where your ability to even have water and wastewater depends on the community where you live. There's a lot of injustice, I would say, that communities like ours have had to endure. And so for me, I want to bring as many resources home to the community as possible. I want our local governments to have great funding so that they are able then to provide water and wastewater to constituents so that they can improve quality of life. I also want to bring resources home to UTEP so that we can have an economic development competitive edge. I want to link UTEP to the Department of Defense and bring resources through that so that we can create new, better jobs in a new industry. So almost everything that I do and that my team and I do together is about how do we bring home results and bring home dollars for El Paso so that El Paso then can provide a better quality of life and more economic development for our residents. I'm part of a generation, I'm sure, as you are, a lot of our family members, our primas, primos, our friends left El Paso to find opportunity elsewhere. I'm my generation. A lot of my friends left after college and never came back. I have 4 brothers. After they finished their higher education, they also went off and found opportunities elsewhere. I was the only one who came back right after school to make a life here. I want my kids to come back if they choose to. I want them to have the option. I want them to have the opportunity. They're 26 years old and 24 years old, my son and my daughter. But I want them to see El Paso as a place of opportunity. And I want that for your students and for all of the young people that we have. But we've got to create a community with higher quality of life and better jobs if we want that. So that is really fundamental to my day-to-day mission.
I know that you mentioned immigration is one of the issues you're passionate about. Recently, from the pictures that I saw, you were with President Joe Biden on Air Force One when he made his visit to El Paso. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. It was an incredible privilege to bring the president to our community. And I'd been talking to the White House for a while about a presidential visit. And, I want us to look at El Paso, not just, and us, I mean the federal government, not just as a place where migration happens, but also as a key artery for the United States economy. And so I have long had those conversations with my colleagues and with the White House and with the president. But everything kind of came to a head in our community in terms of the number of refugees arriving at our nation's front door here in El Paso in December. And in the weeks leading up to the holidays, we were seeing thousands of people fleeing their home country, fleeing their homeland, leaving everything behind to try to make a new start in our country. And our system is not set up to deal with the extraordinary numbers. But my belief firmly is that we must rise to the occasion as a country. We must treat people with dignity, with respect, with compassion, and that we've got to solve these longstanding challenges on the migration front. So I had a conversation in early December with the White House about, this is a really important time for the president to visit. I want him to see for himself what's happening on the ground in our community. But I also want him to meet the people who are providing that dignity on the ground, whether it's our local leaders or whether it's humanitarian workers. It was important for me that he see that, hear that, and talk to folks. So when I got the call from the White House saying, okay, we're going to accept your invitation, we're excited about going, it was thrilling and exciting, and I was eager for it to happen. And being able to fly from DC to El Paso with the president obviously gave me time to visit with him about what was going on. And he's an incredible person, so kind, so thoughtful, so experienced and knowledgeable. And so we had a great conversation, and then he asked, okay, what would you do to fix this? If you were in my shoes, what would you do? So we had a great conversation around that, told him my own thoughts of what the White House could do more of. But I also acknowledged, ultimately it's on Congress. Congress has not changed immigration laws in decades. And I will keep working on that. I will keep pushing on my colleagues to take legislative action. But while you're on the ground, here's what I want you to pay attention to and think about. And it was a really extraordinary experience to be able to show the President of the United States our great community that is able to rise to a humanitarian challenge with dignity, goodwill, and love.
And so that's wonderful that you have the ear of one of the strongest leaders in the world, and hopefully that brings us more resources and more understanding, because DC and Latin America are very far away, and so it's good for them to have somebody that knows the community and knows the area. And so speaking of immigration, I know that one moment that I was very proud of, and that has come up recently is the August 3rd shooting, and so I think that also dealt with immigration and the fact that it was somebody that was anti-Mexican and drove several hours for the express purpose of killing and doing harm to our community. And so I remember watching that press conference, and most of our male leadership was sitting, and you and some of the other leaders were standing. What made you call it a hate crime, whereas our governor wanted to just call it a mental health crisis?
That was one of the most painful periods for our community ever, and something that I know many of our residents are still grappling with. I mean, that day, all of El Paso essentially became a victim to gun violence, because being a victim of gun violence means you or a loved one or someone close to you has been impacted by gun violence. And we joined the terrible club that exists in our country of communities that have had to deal with mass shootings. But you're right, Dr. Peregrino, that act of violence was coupled with an act of racism and an act of hate. And that day, I will never forget, I was trying to get information. I got the news while we were in the middle of a town hall meeting. And one of my staffers came up and said, "Congresswoman, you need to send everybody home. There was a mass shooting in the Cielo Vista area, and our constables who were there for security purposes, they need to, they're being called, and so we've got to get everybody home." So we sent everybody home. We interrupted the town hall meeting. My team and I drove to the El Paso downtown office, and I was trying to get information on what was going on. I was hoping to get some kind of a briefing, but it was really hard to get information. And then I learned that the governor was flying in, and that there would be a briefing done at the 911 center. And so I said, I'm heading over there. I need to find out what's going on. And a number of other community leaders also drove to participate in the briefing that we received from law enforcement. And it was during that briefing that we learned basically the extent of the violence, the extent of the bloodshed, that the fact that the killer, the domestic terrorist, had basically pulled up behind a police officer and turned himself in. And so there was this sense of relief that he had been caught. But it was also very clear, it was made very clear to us, and the governor was in the room when law enforcement told us he confessed to the crime and he confessed to the motivation. And he said he was motivated to come here to slaughter Mexicans and immigrants and to deal with what he called the Hispanic invasion. That language was used by then President Donald Trump to describe migrants and to basically instill fear and hatred in people. And unfortunately, Dr. Peregrino, it's still a phrase used by many of my colleagues in DC and by leaders at the state level. But it was clear, all of us had an understanding that day that it was motivated by racism. And so when we came out, I and others were not invited to speak at the press conference, and it was, as you said, it was a table of, a group of men providing the briefing. It was the mayor at the time, the police chief at the time, the governor, and federal law enforcement. And a reporter near the end of the briefing asked the governor specifically, I think he was from Vice News. He was there actually following me as I was showing 20 of my colleagues around El Paso. And he stayed because of the shooting, and he asked the governor very explicitly, "Governor, another white male with a manifesto and a gun. What does this say about the current state of affairs?" And sure enough, using NRA talking points, the governor of our state, who had just been briefed that this was a hate crime, instead alluded to it being a mental health issue. And we know for a fact that the mentally ill are more likely to be victims of a violent crime than to be perpetrators of it. And thankfully, a local reporter then asked me to respond to the same question. And I thought it was important that the public understand what was the driver. And so I took the microphone from the governor and I essentially relayed to the public what we knew was factual and true, which was that it was a hate crime.
And I think that's important because I felt there, that there was somebody there giving what many of us recognized when we saw that. And you're right, those 23 lives forever impacted, people from El Paso, people from Juarez, and so I just wanted to, to thank you for doing that, because I feel that otherwise we get this, I guess, gaslighting, that
That's right.
we're being lied to, and it was a domestic terror situation. And I guess my other question for you, and I don't know your stance on this, the federal government seems to have taken the death penalty off the table, and now the shooter has pled guilty. But how do you feel that? Do you feel that it's okay that this person is not getting the death penalty?
That's a really tough question, I know, because it was so much horrific violence that was perpetrated on our community in a brutal, horrible way. And your gut instinct is to take out as much retribution on the person perpetrating that crime as possible. But I have to tell you, Dr. Peregrino, I have never supported the death penalty for a number of reasons. I do think it's barbaric for the government to essentially take someone's life. I think that in many respects, there's more justice to having someone live out the remainder of their days behind bars, being forced to grapple with the violence and the pain that they committed against a community. It is, as we know, research has shown us that the death penalty, using the death penalty, is far more expensive for a community than not, because of the number of appeals that have to take place and the number of experts. And I know that will, that my stance will rub a lot of people the wrong way, but I just fundamentally don't believe in the death penalty. That's the federal government. There will be a state trial, and our local district attorney has said that he will seek the death penalty. And again, that's his decision. It's not mine. I personally don't support the death penalty, but we do have to be prepared as a community for the significant financial cost that will be associated with seeking the death penalty. That will be a cost borne by local property taxpayers. Appeal after appeal after appeal, multi-million-dollar expert after multi-million-dollar expert. And I just, I have held this belief long before the El Paso shooting, and will probably hold this belief against the death penalty for the rest of my life.
No, and I think there are both sides. Other people feel the same, that the person should have time to to think about it and live out his days that way. And other people, because of their religious beliefs, do believe in forgiveness and taking the higher ground. And so I know we've touched upon a number of topics. Is there anything you would like to add that maybe I didn't ask you about at this point?
No, I think the only thing that I would add is how proud I have been in challenge after challenge, crisis after crisis, how proud I've been of our community. El Pasoans, we spoke a little bit ago about the humanitarian crisis with the migrants. El Pasoan after El Pasoan after El Pasoan flocked to downtown to provide blankets, coats, food for vulnerable populations, as we always have done. And during the August 3rd shooting and afterwards, El Pasoans flocked to donate blood and to provide help and support to the victims and the survivors. So I just want to say it's an incredible privilege to represent such a beautiful population of people who really care deeply about one another.
And I agree with you. I'm very proud to live in El Paso and have a community that's so giving. Thank you for representing us in DC. I'd like to end with maybe saying, what kind of services does your office offer to constituents? What can your office do for them if they're having problems with a federal agency?
Thank you for asking. A lot of times people think of a member of Congress as being in the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C., writing laws, appropriating money, and that is indeed what we do. But our El Paso office has a really important function. We are the connector to our constituents who are having a problem with the federal government to trying to get answers for them. So for our constituents who maybe have been waiting forever for their tax return and they can't get a return call from the IRS, call us so that we can help you. Or a veteran who can't get a response from the VA, call us, we can help you. Or someone who needs help with accessing their Social Security benefits and their inquiries have gone nowhere, we can help. So any federal agency, if you are struggling with it, please reach out. 915-541-1400.
And so my guest has been Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. Congresswoman, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, my privilege.